The Secrets of Star Trek is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous supporters. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/donate. You're listening to The Secrets of Star Trek, episode number 17.
Captain to bridge.
Spock here.
Make it so. Surrender is not an option.
Attention crew of the Enterprise, this is James Kirk.
We are all explorers, driven to know what's over the horizon, what's beyond our own shores.
We would have helped you get home if you had asked. That's who Starfleet is.
Hi, I'm Don Bettinelli, and you're listening to The Secrets of Star Trek, where we discuss the hidden layers and deeper meanings found in all the Star Trek TV series, movies, more and more that's coming. And today we're continuing our overview of the Star Trek series by discussing the next one in the line, Deep Space Nine. Very excited to talk about it because this may, and I think it's unanimous, maybe our favorite of the Star Trek series so far. And when I say our, I'm meaning that joining me today on the panel are Jimmy Akin. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
And Father Cory Sticha. Hi, Father Cory.
How's it going?
Great. So before we get into Deep Space Nine, I just want to remind listeners that we're finishing up our 2018 SQPN listener survey. We're looking for feedback from the listeners on what we're doing, what we could be doing, what we could be doing better. We want to hear from you because what we're doing is for you. We want to reach you and with the things that you want to listen to. So if you could if you have not already, go to sqpn.com/survey and fill out the survey. It should only take a few minutes. It's a number of questions, but some of them are sort of open-ended, so you can put as little or as much as you want. Others are just click a button, but shouldn't take you too long. And as an incentive, we are going to be giving away to two random participants in the survey. We're going to be giving away a $50 gift card to Amazon. So you could go out and buy DVD sets of Star Trek seasons, perhaps, or something along those lines. So if you can go to sqpn.com/survey, we would greatly appreciate it. So Deep Space Nine. Am I right? This is my favorite. Is this unanimous?
Yeah.
We all kind of agreed on that, definitely.
Not that it begins that way, but it definitely goes that way.
Right. Like a lot of the series, they gets better over time. So let's sort of set the background for this. Where we start with this, and which is it starts in January of 1993. It was when it started to air, and it was in syndication, direct to syndication, just like The Next Generation was. And it was set in a space station. The idea was purposefully to make this different from The Next Generation, which was still airing already. It was, in fact, Next Gen would go on for another couple of seasons after this to get its full run in. And they decided to set it on a space station. One of the things that's sort of distinct. Go ahead.
And there's plot logic behind that because you need to distinguish each series from every other series. Otherwise, right. People will say, well, we've seen this before. What makes this any different? So most of these Star Trek series are set on a Federation spaceship that has military and exploratory functions. So what makes them different? Well, after the first one, the next one, it's The Next Generation. So everything gets a little bit of an upgrade and you get new characters. And Voyager, what's different about that? They're lost. Enterprise, what's different about that? They're first.
Right.
And so you have some significant shift in what's happening. And this one, the shift is we're not on a spaceship at all. We're on a space station.
Right. And by putting it on a space station, it changes things a bit. It's this series is darker than Next Gen.
Mm-hmm.
The storylines are not just physically darker, but like the storylines are a bit darker. You have more conflict between the characters and in general. It was famously one of Gene Roddenberry's rules for Star Trek was no conflict between the Starfleet crew. They'll bicker and argue sometimes good naturedly, but not like real dramatic conflict between them.
Yeah, and one of the reasons, and this was one of the criticisms of Deep Space Nine, but it's actually one of its strengths, is that it does violate Gene Roddenberry's vision. And the only way it got made was because Gene was dying at the time the concept was pitched.
Right.
If he had lived and been in good health, they wouldn't have been able to get away with everything they got away with.
Right.
Even then, they're still constrained by the Gene Roddenberry vision in a way that more recent projects like Star Trek Discovery are not.
Oh yeah.
But they were able to break out of the Roddenberry mold enough to inject some better storytelling. Yeah. Another thing the space station setting does is it lets them have recurring characters who are guest characters in a way that's harder on a spaceship, because on a spaceship the guest cast is largely going to be drawn from whatever planet you're visiting this week. Right. And here, because we're always in the same spot, we can have this larger cast of recurring characters in and out of the plot and build them over time. So not only do we have a rich ensemble cast, but we have on Deep Space Nine a rich extended cast that we eventually get to know really well, with characters like Lita and Rom and Nog and the Grand Nagus and Moogie and all those people.
And one of my personal complaints with DS9, I say it's my favorite, and it truly is, but the first couple of seasons, they got very soap opera-ish.
Yeah.
Because it was focused on this small group in this, one space, it really did kind of feel like a soap opera for a while. Now that's not to say there weren't good stories told as part of this soap opera, and it didn't set the basis for what we then saw in the Cardassian Dominion War, but it took time to get there, and that really was kind of its weakness starting out.
Early on, it was very episodic. It was just like Next Gen, pretty much, and the original series before it, and like a lot of series at the time, it was story of the week, alien of the week, ship of the week, whatever it was. But starting around that time, where they encountered the Dominion and had some of those storylines building, that's when they grew the mythology and the story arc that really carried them through to the end.
And of course, you had the story arc of the Bajorans and the Prophets and all that were slowly being built as well. That played a much more prominent role in later seasons.
Yeah, although it's interesting how they handle Bajor, because originally it's kind of like our exotic planet that we're supposed to fall in love with and find interesting and stuff, and I'm like totally bored with it. What I find interesting is not Bajor. What I find interesting are individual people from Bajor, like Kira and the Kai and Gul Dukat's history with Bajor and things like that. It's the character driven stuff from Bajor that I find interesting. The planet itself is a backdrop, and other than they mention it's really beautiful and occasionally show us a picture, I'm not that interested in Bajor as a planet.
You don't want to settle in Dakar province after you retire?
In Dakar province? No, I don't think so. I have this cabin there I'm planning on not building. And some of the Bajor stories early on, because originally before the Dominion and everything, that's what they had to tell stories about. So they did a lot of Bajor stuff that was pretty boring. And some of it was just dumb. I remember this one episode where Miles O'Brien has to become the ritual storyteller for a village.
Oh yes.
That was hard to watch.
One of the worst episodes ever.
Yeah, that was hard to watch. That was not a good one.
The Dalrog confronts the village, but the village is strong. And, it was just awful.
Tell the story of Darmok and Jalada Tanagra.
That would be better.
Speaking of
speaking of Bajorans, one of the things that we get from this, which is probably due to the fact that this is the first series without Gene Roddenberry's direct influence, is religion on Star Trek. We have in previous series and in other places, religion is kind of hokey, and we dismiss it as a superstition. But in Deep Space Nine,
in Next Gen, we get other. I mean, and there's a covert story that Gene Roddenberry keeps telling about. We meet God, and he's not that great.
Yeah.
But we do have positive references to religion in the original series and in the animated series. But in terms of any kind of sustained treatment of religion, that really starts with Deep Space Nine.
Right. And so we have the Bajoran religion, which, again, it's sort of partially religion, partially treated seriously because what we have are the wormhole aliens that the Bajorans treat as their gods. And so,
which makes no sense if they're calling them prophets. Prophets speak on behalf of gods. They're not gods.
Right, exactly.
So little religious illiteracy on the part of the writers there.
But at least there are people who, I mean, you have a variety of religious experience here. You have to kind of transliterate some of our own language. You have Orthodox Bajorans, you have liberal Bajorans, you have
Satanist Bajorans.
Exactly.
You have religious leadership that's all about the political advancement of themselves. Others who are very holy and about, like you have Kaiopaka, who's the holy saintly Popess, and you have
the John the 23rd of the 24th century.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you have Kai Wynn. We won't say who she's of the 21st century, but
you can fill in the blank there.
Fill in whatever blank you like, depending on your historical. She might be a Borgia Popess.
It's interesting too, though, that a major component of the series long storyline is Ben Sisko's journey from being basically a flat out typical Roddenberry atheist to really embracing almost the Bajoran religion, even understanding that these prophets that they worship are just aliens, but he still embraces a lot of the elements of the religion. When he first started out, he struggled with it, but he really began to embrace it.
And his story arc, unfortunately, is tragically aborted right at the last minute. Because of Avery Brooks.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, do you want to say more about that? Can you that people might be interested?
Yeah. So as we go through, spoiler warning, 20 years later, 25 years later, as we progress through the series, Ben Sisko does begin to embrace more and more his role as the emissary of the prophets. And we even discover his mom was a prophet. And so he's half prophet himself. And he's warned that if he marries a human woman, Cassidy Yates, that there's going to be a big price to be paid. And he goes ahead and marries her anyway. And she becomes pregnant. And the original ending for his character, what the price was he was going to become a prophet, and he would thus have to abandon her and her child. And it's a logical and dramatic and, not entirely predictable end point for his character, which makes it good, turning Ben Sisko into a prophet at the end. And he's now got to go to the Celestial Temple and say goodbye to everybody. That would be a great ending for his character. But given that he had married Cassidy in the show and she was now pregnant with their unborn child, Avery Brooks says, and Avery Brooks has a lot of concerns about race, even in the 24th century, said, no way am I as a black man abandoning my unborn child. That's just the wrong message to send. And he applied a 20th/21st century social situation onto that and refused to do the ending that had been planned. And so they rewrote it so that instead of becoming a prophet, he's just going off to be trained by the prophets for an unknown period of time, but may be back with Cassidy at any moment. And it really takes all of the drama and the tragedy out of the ending.
What's interesting is in the books, which continue the continuity, and I don't know if it's like Star Wars where they have, or where it's official continuity or not, but where they continue the continuity, he comes back but he and Cassidy end up divorcing because of the pressure of this prophecy about the bad end that is coming because of what they did. I haven't kept up with all the books, so I don't know if eventually they reconcile. There's hints that it might. So it's an interesting take on it that at least somebody within the Paramount area has taken with it. But it's interesting that he had that. I mean, I applaud that he wants to provide good male fatherhood role models for African Americans. That's a great thing.
That's good, but it
dramatically
this story.
Yeah, but dramatically it subverts it. Yeah. All right. Speaking of Ben Sisko, I don't want to skip talking about a key thing that he starts with, which is we talked about no conflict among characters, but he starts out with hating the beloved Captain Picard, which is a very risky maneuver, a risky decision by the producers. To start out their new series with this character who's their lead, hating the lead of the other series. And the reason he hated him is because of when Picard was at
Wolf aboard.
Wolf 359.
Wolf 359, and that's when Sisko's wife, Jennifer, died in that battle because of Picard. And I think Sisko knows it's not necessarily rational because that Picard was taken over by the Borg, but nevertheless still bears this grudge. It's an interesting beginning to this character, and sort of shows how the things would go in this series, sort of unexpectedly.
And it is a flaw because you can't blame Picard for his actions at Wolf 359. He was not in control of himself, but it shows the interest that the writers have in the psychology of Sisko as a character. And the fact that he's not entirely rational, and that goes through the rest of the cast. All of the characters on the show, all of the recurring characters have various have complex personalities with sharp edges, and they clash the sharp edges against each other, which makes it so much more fun.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big reasons why we say we like this series over all the rest of them, because the characters seem so much more three-dimensional than previous and following series, shall we say.
Yes.
And even before the series really hits its stride, we have some complex stuff being done psychologically. There's an episode called Duet, where it focuses on Major Kira, the Bajoran liaison to the station, and a Cardassian war criminal who comes aboard the station. And we think that this guy is really a war criminal, and it turns out he's not. He's just he was like a file clerk for the Cardassians, and it has come up with this complex way of trying to atone for his people's occupation of Bajor as he's dying.
He's basically mentally ill in a sense.
Yeah, but you have this intense psychological portrait where Kira becomes his caretaker and progressively learns more about who he is and what his motives are as he's in the process of dying. And part of the resolution to the plot is she going to stick by this guy who's fundamentally on the side of good? Or is she going to be so disgusted with him, she's just going to walk away and let him die in pain?
Right. And Kira's character as a whole is very interesting as they developed it, because, of course, she was a part of the rebellion. She was part of the resistance against the Cardassians. And, of course, eventually her character develops to the point where she is the person in power, at least as far as the station is concerned.
Yeah.
And there are a couple episodes that really hinge on that, with her struggle with, I was the person fighting people like me.
Yeah. And in fact, they make the point she was a terrorist, and she would use terrorist tactics, and then similar tactics get used against her.
Exactly. And that really makes one of the interesting characters because of that. She got to see both sides of that fight.
Speaking of the Cardassians and the Bajorans, that relationship between them, I've seen it in various places in various ways, especially since the Bajoran Cardassian situation was actually created in the Ensign Rowe episode in Next Generation. But I've seen the comparison to various other oppressed peoples. In some places, some people will compare them to the Jews historically,
right.
And others have compared it to, ironically, the Palestinians in another sense. Right. It sort of depends on where you're coming from, I guess. But
you could have the Bajorans as the Irish,
right? Exactly, and in some ways, they're all of them. I mean, the way that the writers develop the characters, they become variously all of these different oppressed peoples that we know of historically. And it's very interesting. I mean, that's another one of the great parts of it is that we see firsthand the struggles of a people who are standing up after they've been freed, not because they necessarily, won a war of independence like America did, but because the Cardassians were kind of done with them and just walked away. They got what they needed.
They used I don't know that I'd say the Cardassians got what they needed, but you had a successful resistance that eventually wore the Cardassians out to where they voluntarily left. And the situation is without a major war. The situation actually is kind of like the liberation of Southern Ireland in certain ways. So that's interesting. One character that I really think is great and gets better as we go along is Dukat. Mark Ilamo's portrayal of Dukat is awesome, especially as we get to know him, and he becomes he really is one of those villains who thinks he's a good guy. Yes, he also is really a villain.
Well, he had lines where he talks about, I was so gentle with the Bajorans. I treated them so well, and he was one of the more brutal dictators on Bajor.
Yeah. Right. There's in particular an episode fairly late in the run, shortly before he turns to the Pirates, where he and Sisko are trapped on a planetoid. And it's just the two of them. But by this point, Dukat's mental condition has deteriorated so much that he's hallucinating Major Kira and Wayoon and his assistant, who's named Damar, and they're all tormenting him secretly, and he's trying to hide it from Sisko. And it's such an awesome episode.
Yeah, there are points in the series where Dukat goes from enemy to friend, back to enemy. I mean, he's all over the place.
Pity.
Yeah. I mean, and in the end, he just loses it. He's insane. He's possessed by evil and insane, and has destroyed his own people by throwing him with the Dominion when he did. And I mean, it was such another great Cardassian character is Garrick. I loved Garrick.
Oh, yeah.
One of my
Garrick
favorite characters.
Awesome. The simple Tailor.
The simple Tailor, yes. Tinker Tailor, soldier spy. That sort of idea.
Exactly.
He just such a convoluted, complex character who is always going to scheme. Nothing is ever the way it is on the surface, which is great because they always pair him up with Bashir, who is such a simple kind of guy.
He just delighted in pulling Bashir along that, yes, I'm just a simple tailor, but I know things,
Right, exactly. I mean, of course,
had him hopping. We
know by the end that Garrick is, he is a spy extraordinaire and that sort of thing. But he pulls us along through the story with him, with this cover story. Yeah. So another one.
In addition to the characters, which we mentioned as one of the things that attract us to the show, one of the things that attracts me in particular is the story, the plot.
Yeah.
I tend to be very plot focused, and if something doesn't have an interesting plot, it's hard for me to get into it. But I love big, complex plots.
Yes.
And that's what we eventually get in Deep Space Nine. It takes until about season 3 or 4 for the plot to really launch. But then we get a 3 or 4 year run of basically one story. Right. And it gets more intense. The linkage between the episodes gets more intense as we go, especially in the final season. They have like a 13 episode run that's just one chapter after another with very little break between the episodes. And I really like that. It's the first time we see a war in the Star Trek universe that takes more than a two-parter to resolve, which to me is like, that's a skirmish or something. That's not a war.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the war has costs. I mean, it is a brutal war. People, characters we see die. I mean, there's that one episode where Jake gets caught behind the lines and he's in basically a MASH unit in Starfleet, you know?
Exactly.
There's another episode where, what was it, O'Brien and Bashir and some others and Nog are stuck on this planet with the equivalent of Starfleet Marines, you know, in a trench warfare situation. I mean, they really grab the costs of war by the lapels and hold on.
Nog loses a leg. We have planets that we know, like Bajor, being taken over by the enemy, the Federation at one.
Yep.
Beta Z. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm in Beta Z.
Yeah.
At one point, the Federation is basically losing the war.
Right.
So it's very dramatic.
I mean, massive ship battles, and it's really incredible. That's a big reason why I think we like this show so much, is they tell this grand story as part of it.
The scale is so huge, I think, at times. It's a galaxy-wide story, which is ironic given the fact that it started out as people asking, well, how could it be interesting if it's all just stuck on a space station and they don't go anywhere? I mean, it eventually becomes this huge story. But I mean, speaking of not going anywhere, they set it on the space station to contrast with Next Gen, which was on a spaceship, and they weren't allowed to have a spaceship basically until
the runabouts. They had the runabouts, which were a little fancier than shuttles.
They were basically bigger space shuttles. And then they ended Next Gen, ended its run, and then we get the Defiant, which was interesting. They added a starship, short range essentially, to and then we opened up some new stories. And with the starship, we got Worf from Next Gen. Michael Dorn, I suppose, wasn't over sitting in the makeup chair for hours a day while working, I guess.
You know, I honestly wonder, kind of looking back, if that was initially a decision based on he wanted to continue the character.
Yeah.
Or if that was a decision on they realized he would be a draw.
It was the latter, and it wasn't the writers of Deep Space Nine. They did not want Worf. It was the network. The network,
and that doesn't surprise me.
Said he's a popular character. We want to boost the ratings. Let's bring Worf over. And the Deep Space Nine guys didn't, which at this point is being run by Ira Stephen Burr, who's a really good writer. He had cut his teeth on Star Trek on the Next Gen, and then moved over. He'd left for a while, and then come back and become the showrunner for Deep Space Nine at this point. And he was like, his attitude, I've read interviews with him about this, and his attitude was, we didn't want Worf. We already had a cast, and what is he going to add, really, in terms of our character dynamics? He's pretty similar to the people we have already. I mean, Worf and Odo, or Worf and Kira, they're playing in the same character sandbox. Yeah. And so, but his attitude was, okay, if we're going to get stuck with him, let's turn this into an asset. He also said, of all of the Next Gen characters, Worf is the one that would work best on Deep Space Nine. I mean, you can't really imagine Gates McFadden or Marina Sirtis becoming a regular.
The only caveat I would say on that, of course, is the one character they did bring over from Next Gen. Well, Miles O'Brien.
O'Brien, but he was there. His attitude, because he addressed that, he said that he didn't have a problem bringing over O'Brien because O'Brien was somewhat a blank slate. Yeah. He had never really. He was a minor character. Yeah, and we got to then in Deep Space Nine build him out. But Worf was already a known quantity. There wasn't a huge amount they could do with his character until they paired him up with Jadzia, which was great. Yes. But because of the introduction of the Klingons, they basically delayed the story by a season. They had already been at the point of getting into conflict with the Dominion when suddenly they have to accommodate Worf and Klingon culture. And so they spent basically a year doing that before they got back to the main plot.
Speaking of Dax, Jadzia Dax, we had this again, another big moment, which, we had the death of Tasha Yar in the beginning of the Next Generation, but she was still pretty new. So there wasn't a huge fan affinity for her necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But Jadzia Dax, they killed her off in the sixth season?
End of the sixth season.
End of the sixth season. Okay. After she married Worf, they were married, and then brought the Dax symbiote back with Ezri, and it was controversial. And Terry Farrell, who played Jadzia, didn't want to go. She made it clear. She's always made it clear that she didn't want to go. It was the producers wanted to write her off. Is that off, or
it's sort of in it. She wanted, if I recall correctly, I'm trying to remember exactly what her terms were. She wanted an adjustment. I think it was she wanted to be able to take some time to do some side projects, and there may have been money involved, but she had certain conditions that she wanted to continue, and the higher level studio people didn't end up meeting them. And Ira Stephen Bear has said, if I had known that is what she wanted, I would have made it happen. And we would have continued with her. But it was kind of a miscommunication where the relevant parties were not all communicating in a way that they all knew what needed to happen to keep her. Right. Having said that, when she did go, I thought Ezri was a great replacement.
Yes.
I mean, I would have loved to have Jadzia through season 7, but Ezri was a good replacement given that they had to replace her. Ezri was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm actually sorry we didn't get more of Ezri. We went from ultra confident Jadzia to very tentative Ezri, and that was, but yet the same person. And where have we seen that before? And what TV series have we seen?
Yeah,
I
don't know. Gee, what could have been?
I mean, that idea of a continuity of memory and sort of mission, but different personalities. I mean, that's Doctor Who, and we see that and so this was a different way of doing that in this, and that was welcome. I like that.
And so, and they were both. I mean, they were both great characters, and I do like the way they filled out the Trill. Of course, the Trill we had seen in Next Generation, but really didn't know a lot about them. We knew that they had the symbiote and that the symbiote went from host to host to host, but we really didn't know a lot about them. And they really filled out that race incredibly with the Dax symbiote. And, again, to see that where a little bit of Jadzia's personality would come out, a little bit of her feelings, and, of course, the relationship between the Dax symbiote and Sisko and how that played out throughout the entire series. Right. I mean, that was just, it was a very interesting characters.
So we could talk for a lot longer on Deep Space Nine because there's so much more, and I have a lot more notes. But I kind of want to,
and we will, just not in this episode,
right? As we go through the individual episodes in the future, a lot of this stuff will come up, and we'll talk more about Odo and the Ferengi and everything else in the Mirror Universe.
We might just have to do an episode of the Ferengi in DS9. I mean, there's so much you could talk about them.
And how it improved the Ferengi from Next Gen. But I don't. That would be. We've almost gotten a tangent.
That would be another episode.
But I do want to say one thing is there is a Deep Space Nine documentary that's been made and is in post production called "What We Left Behind," and it was created by the former showrunners. Ira Stephen Barr is created it. They got access to all the archives. They had a lot of the stars were involved. I don't know if Avery Brooks was. I've never seen him in any of the promotional material. They did a Kickstarter for it, so I didn't see him in the Kickstarter materials, but they might have got him for interviews or something. But certainly everyone else, Alexander Siddig, Terry Farrell, Nana Visitor. So lots of people who did come up. Gosh, we didn't even talk about the holographic nightclub.
Vix.
Vix, yeah. Oh my, that's coming
so much
up.
More.
So much more. Anyway, so just to say that that documentary they said will be out by the end of the year. So that's
cool.
In fact, we're recording this prior to October. So it may already be out. I don't know. But they did say by the end of the year, and that they're hoping, because they're redoing some of the graphics, some of the special effects from DS9 in high def format for this documentary, they're hoping that it kind of gives a goose to Paramount or CBS or whoever owns the rights to the DVDs now in the streaming to do what they did for Next Gen and the original series, which is to redo the special effects and to redo the whole series, frankly, in high def. You can watch Star Trek Deep Space Nine on Netflix and I think on Amazon too, but it's in the old format, 4:3 format, so it's not as good as watching the other series is at the moment. So let's hope. So any last thoughts, Father Cory? Any last thoughts on Deep Space Nine?
Nope.
How about you, Jimmy?
Nope, I think that's good.
All right. So then that's it from us. What did you, the listener, think of Deep Space Nine? Was it your favorite series? Was it not your favorite series? I'd love to hear from people who didn't like Deep Space Nine. That would be interesting to get your take on it. But we'd love to hear any opinion on what we thought or on the series as a whole from your opinion. So you can do that, but let us know. Go to sqpn.com/Trek. Or go to the SQPN Facebook page. Either way, find today's show listing and leave us a comment. Leave some feedback. You can send us email to trek@sqpn.com. Also, if you could, go to iTunes and give us a 5-star review. That would help us raise the profile of our podcast up in the rankings of amongst all the other Star Trek podcasts out there. It would help us get some more visibility and reach a larger audience. And for that, we would be most grateful. We're already grateful for those of you who have done that. We also, if you could, like on Facebook, share it to the podcast to your friends, retweet it, all those other things. If you have Star Trek fan friends, let them know we're doing this and that they might enjoy this. So we'd really appreciate that. So we'll be back next time when we'll be discussing an overview of Star Trek Voyager. And until then, Father Cory Sticha, thank you for joining me and sharing the secrets of Star Trek.
I'm glad to be here, and thank you, Dom.
Jimmy Akin, thank you as well.
Live long and prosper.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening, and remember, I will learn to live with it, because I can live with it. I can live with it. Computer, erase this whole entire personal life.